In this video, I'm going to tell you about the concept of weird war and why I find it so cool. So what is weird war? Well, weird war is basically kind of alternate history. If playing a normal war game, and by war game I mean historical war game, something that basically kind of happened. World War II, Civil War, Napoleonic Wars, whatever, that kind of stuff. As opposed to, elves and dwarves and space combat and, whatnot. I'm talking about what we in the kind of hobby generally refer to as historicals, okay? Normally, historicals are called that because they sort of really adhere to history. So they don't make tanks that don't do things that those tanks didn't do. That kind of stuff. You kind of try, the outcome of any given battle may obviously be different. That's the fun of the game part of it. But the concept is that you generally want to make sure that everything does what kind of it sort of did and looked kind of sort of how it looked. Those guys, their pants, they weren't blue until 1847. So you may want to fix that. That kind of stuff, that's what we kind of think of as historicals. And Weird War sort of turns that at an angle. So the concept of weird war can be done in generally any kind of war. I will admit that most of them seem to be based around 1940s kind of World War II sort of era, but there are other ones that are starting to crop up. But the concept is that at some point something changed. Most alternate histories start with something going differently than it actually did in our past. So in the game Dust, basically some point in the 30s, before coming to power, kind of the Nazis, as I remember it, went down to Antarctica and found a UFO frozen under the ice and cut it out, brought it back, analyzed it, reverse engineered it, and then they made some pretty powerful stuff with which to go into World War II. And then things kind of went from there. That's the right turn, that's the different angle that a normal Weird War game takes. Most of them have their own sort of thing. Another of my favorites is also Conflict 47. Conflict 47, the concept is basically, as we were testing the nukes in the southwestern part of the United States, we opened a tiny little rift. From what I remember from reading it a while back, we opened a tiny little rift and there was a radio signal coming out, which we eventually decoded and then learned all kinds of new things about science that we had not previously known. And then that's what changed things. And then when things went forward, and then eventually you had laser tanks and GIs in power armor and all of that. But again, like I said, though most of them seem to be pretty focused around World War II, the very first one that I've ever seen was a game called ae-wwii, which stood for Alternate Events World War II, and that came out sometime back in the mid-2000s. Not all of them seem to be based off of the whole concept of World War II. Some of them, there's a game called Shattered Crown by Gaddis Gaming, and that one is based off of World War I. He was running it at the Tabletop Minions Expo last year, and I didn't get a chance to play, but I got to take a bunch of pictures, and I'm looking forward to hopefully getting to play again this year. It's a cool system. Some of the guys that I work with are getting into it, and it's just starting to show how the concept of Weird War is sort of filling this niche between the people who, like me, who are generally more into the fantastical, between us and then the people who are very into the, historical, because there's times when I have historical leanings, but I still kind of want a laser tank once in a while. Some of the big ones right now are Conflict 47, which is made by Warlord Games. And Conflict 47 is based off of the bolt-action engine, which is a World War II historical game. This uses much of the same engine, the same rule set, but it even uses many of the same models, though you may have, tanks that walk on two legs, and zombie and or werewolf troops. Sometimes you just still need a bunch of guys, with Tommy guns. So you can use some models from Bolt Action in Conflict 47, and very frequently you can take the tanks that you might use in Conflict 47 and just take off the laser turret and put on a regular turret, and now you've got a Panzer or a Sherman or whatever. That kind of being able to use them kind of grounds it still in the concept of the real, but also then, gives it that extra sort of fantastical flair that I find really sort of interesting. Another big one right now is called Dust, and it is originally based off of a kind of a concept and a world idea that was a comic book and then kind of a board game, and then it moved into a sort of tactical sort of board game, and it was called Dust Tactics. It was produced by Fantasy Flight Games. Then it turned into an actual full-blown regular miniature war game written by Andy Chambers and Mac Martin, the spectacular Dust Warfare, which is still one of my favorite miniature games out there. And that game is where this guy came from. This is from the tabletop, or this is from the tactics line, but you could also use it in the warfare line for Dust. Many of the models came primed but not painted. So this one was originally gray, and then I did a bunch of work, but primed gray. I did a bunch of work over the top of it. But, the Allies ones were green, and it was a great system. It had flyers, it had walking tanks, it had crazy troops of all different kinds, and then they eventually even came up with a third faction, which was the kind of Sino-Russian sort of faction. It was Chinese, Sino-Soviet, I think is what they called it. And now that it's Dust 1947, and it's left Fantasy Flight, and it's back in the creator's hands, Paolo Parente, I believe is how you pronounce it, but I'm probably wrong. Now it's a whole new system, and they've added even another faction from what I understand, and they keep expanding it. These types of games, to me, scratch kind of a special itch in that you can use kind of the ideas that you have about historicals, but yet if you want to kind of get a little bit more creative and go in a different direction, there's no reason you can't, Again, if you're painting troops and you've decided, I think that they're going to go with black pants. There's no reason. If someone says, well, yeah, but those types of Tommy gun guys never had black pants. And I'm like, well, but what about the guys who are vampires? You know what I mean? Like, you can kind of just decide to change things as you will and have a good time with it. It doesn't seem as if every single war, though, has, weird war games attached to it. Like, I haven't seen particularly weird war for like Napoleonics. I haven't seen it for I was going to say I haven't seen it for Civil War, but really Osprey's Dracula's America kind of fits in that area. It's around the same time, but it's not directly the war. It's cowboys and some leftover, sort of Civil War people and a bunch of different things, and of course vampires. But yeah, the World War I game I was talking about, Shattered Crown, that sort of turning point that game took was really interesting because basically it took the idea that War of the Worlds was not just a radio program, it was a thing that actually happened. And after all of the Martians died from their, from the common cold, all their stuff was left on our planet, and then we took it apart and sort of figured out how parts of it worked, and then you get, World War I style looking tanks, but with Tesla cannons and cool stuff like that. So these types of things, these kind of types of concepts can be fun for, I think, both the people who are into historical stuff and maybe want just a little bit of a difference, maybe a little bit of something new, and the people like myself who sometimes are interested in historical, but generally are a little bit more interested in fantastical. So you can really sort of scratch both itches. And if you go with a game something like Conflict 47 from Warlord, you've got that benefit of these models, some of them are literally almost convertible in that you can take the turret off and then put a different turret on, and now it's a completely different type of tank. It goes from regular historical tank to crazy Tesla coil shooting whatever type tank, and that's kind of an interesting concept for me as a modeler, and also for me as a person who likes to play games. So if this sounds like it's up your alley, take a look around, go out online and look at some of the games I've mentioned, and if you can think of a game that also fits in this mold, this weird war kind of alternate events, war game, put it in the comments below if I've neglected to mention it. I'd like to hear more, and I think the other viewers would also like to. The concept behind alternate history allows us to, in some situations, play the game, maybe the war, actually, the way that we sort of kind of wish it had been. Some people sometimes don't like historical games because they know how it came out, or maybe they've got friends and family who are actually in that war. But when you start to add sometimes that kind of very, fantastical edge to it, for some people, I think it can become a little bit more interesting, maybe a little bit less scary if that's the concern. For me, it's just, I really like tanks with legs and laser werewolves and all that kind of stuff. You may think the same way. So, take a look at some of these games if you're interested.